So in this diagram, we see the most common sensor sizes for system cameras. They don't look this big, depending upon which screen you're looking at, but the proportions between full frame on the left, APS-C in the middle, and micro four thirds on the right are correct. They are relative to each other correct sizes. Full frame is the type of sensor which corresponds roughly or is similar to the size of 35 millimeter film, the kind of film that we would have a roll of film in a camera that would be 24 or 27 pictures perhaps, and each frame would be approximately this size. 36 millimeters wide, 24 millimeters tall. Next we come to APS-C, a smaller size of a sensor, approximately as wide as full frame is tall, and then so almost 24 millimeters wide and 15.5 millimeters tall. Finally, we come to micro four thirds, the smallest, 17.3 millimeters wide and 13 millimeters tall. Now the question one asks perhaps, or some might ask, is, well, I'm going to use my cell phone. I'm sure that's good enough. What size sensors are there on cell phones or smartphones? I have two smartphones with cameras, one of them from 2018 and one of them from 2019. The OnePlus 6 is the one which I own myself, and we can see the size of the sensor. Again, relative to the other ones is correct size, but it is not the correct size on your screen in terms of millimeters. And then my work cell phone that the university has given me, a Samsung Galaxy S10. The sensor is slightly larger than the one that I have in my own cell phone. Now, cell phone or smartphone manufacturers talk a lot about how many megapixels there are, and it becomes much more difficult to stuff in these tiny, tiny megapixels. The size of the pixels on these smartphones is about 1 micrometer on a side, whereas the size of the pixels, so to speak, in the system camera sensors are larger. And if you have extremely small pixel sizes, then there's a tendency to not perform as well in low light. So you could have a smartphone with a very small sensor, as we see, but with the number of megapixels, so that there are 20 megapixels in it. Whereas the micro four thirds, say, considerably bigger, but say only 16 megapixels. Much better in low light performance because of the sensor, the size of the sensor, even though the number of megapixels are smaller. Yes. When it comes to smartphone cameras, we have certain limitations. As I was saying, we could add more pixels, but as long as the sensor size stays about the same, the pixels will be very small, and this adds some sort of difficulty in the manufacturing process. We could make the sensor bigger and keep the same number of pixels, so we would have larger pixels. Or you could have a variable lens so that you could zoom. In other words, that the camera itself would adjust a lens, its distance to the sensor. You could have 2 or 3 or 4 sensors and lenses for the different focal lengths, and some manufacturers of smartphones seem to be in that direction. Our smartphones, there might be a maximum size which has been reached. Of course, once upon a time, I think many people thought that a 5 or a 6-inch diagonal smartphone was quite large. If we're moving to sizes, say, of 8-inch diagonally, we start to wonder at what point how they will be portable and fit in a pocket anymore. If the sensors get bigger, or we have a variable lens on it, then smartphones will start to become bulkier and not quite as portable. And that sort of defeats the idea of a mobile phone. Or perhaps artificial intelligence will be able to figure out what you actually want in the terms of picture or film, despite the extremely small sensors with these incredibly small pixels. That's possible that will happen. But there, on the other hand, in interchangeable lens system cameras, there is something called diffraction, and there are laws of physics, and there might be, because of laws of physics, limitations for smartphones. There might be some sort of limit as to how far we can go. The artificial intelligence might not always be able to figure out what you actually wanted, and so you might get some very unusual images which the artificial intelligence thinks that you actually want to have. So, suppose for the moment that you think that full frame sensors and cameras like that are not enough, and money is not a problem for you. Well, in that case, you could get a medium format camera. And we see that it has about 44 millimeters in terms of sensor size and width, and 33 millimeters in terms of height. And again, the proportions are correct here with the other kind of sensor sizes. But depending upon what screen you're looking this in, a laptop, a computer monitor, or perhaps even you're looking at this YouTube video on a smartphone, then the size of what you see is not going to correspond to the millimeters that I have written there. And this, if you are a person who thinks in these lines, you'll probably think that bigger is always better. So why should I have an APS-C camera, for example, when I could go straight to a medium format camera? To which I say, well, then maybe you need to get a large format camera. But let's look at some medium format cameras and how the situation for the market for medium format cameras, just the camera bodies, looks like in the beginning of 2021. So here it is March 2021, and here are two examples of medium format cameras. Fujifilm GFX 500S and Hasselblad X1D 250C. And we can see the prices here. I have chosen Amazon.de as some sort of a European EU price. And I have chosen the B&H chain in the United States as a North American price. And we can see that the Amazon.de at this moment seems to be having some sort of a sale. It's a little lower in price as opposed to B&H. Of course, a euro and a dollar are not exactly equivalent. On the other hand, it seems like a Hasselblad in Germany or in the EU is a little more expensive than in North America. It wasn't clear on the website if tax or VAT is included in this. We can see that the Fujifilm camera is quite bulky, particularly on the right. The screen really sticks out. The Hasselblad camera doesn't seem to be quite as bulky. It's very difficult to do justice to this. It could be that the Hasselblad camera is actually wider and taller than the Fujifilm, but not quite as bulky. And as opposed to many other kinds of cameras, system cameras that you might buy on the internet, generally you have to pay shipping and you have to pay for other kinds of things. But in this case, if you buy one of these, the battery and all the necessary cables and shipping are included. Of course, what about the microphones? What about the lens you might need or lenses? What about the tripod you might need to have and so forth? So with these kinds of prices, it might not be so likely that you're going to run out and buy one. You might have to end up spending half as much again for all the other sorts of equipment. And of course, the lens would be probably rather expensive as well. So much better to make sense to buy relatively less expensive full-frame cameras and even less expensive probably APS-C cameras and even less expensive Micro Four Thirds cameras compared to medium format. I just wanted to show this as sort of an example. I can throw in something else here. Someday I may be able to justify to myself the cost of buying a drone, and this is the kind of drone I think I might want to have. And we can see the sensor size, the DJI Mavic Air 2. And as we see that the sensor size is not all that much bigger um, than a typical more high-end kind of smartphone sensor. So this is what we can say in general about image quality. The larger the sensor size, usually bigger means better. On the other hand, if you have a very large sensor, but the quality of the lens that you put on the camera isn't so good, then it doesn't make all that much difference. I was alluding to this before about megapixels, pixels density, pixel size. Yes, in general, the more megapixels you have on a given sensor, the better image quality there might be. But as the pixels get smaller and smaller and smaller, then you start to run into problems when light circumstances, the quality of the light, the amount of light is lower. So in low light situations, a camera with fewer megapixels may give you better pictures than one with more megapixels. The size of the hole, the aperture in the lens that lets in the light, and then that the light continues on its way to the sensor, can influence image quality. The shutter speed, we can freeze things, say like flowing water, with a much faster shutter speed, say at 1/1000th of a second, as opposed to 1/10th of a second. And that can change the quality, or at least the nature of the image that we're looking at, or in our case, the nature of the filming that we're looking at. The object itself that's moving, relatively constant, no movement. We can have, it doesn't matter so much about shutter speed. If it's moving quite a lot, then we're going to have a very fast shutter speed to be able to not get a blur, unless you want to have an artistic effect. And again, the quantity and quality of light can impact or influence on image quality. And then finally, the skill of the photographer or the videographer. When we have a smartphone, of course, it's the programming in the first instance, and then maybe in the second hand, the photographer, him or herself. Now, if you're the average consumer, you might think that the more megapixels there are on a smartphone, the better. But as I said, when we start to add more and more megapixels, then the sensor size at some point is going to have to start to increase more than they are. And the larger the sensor size, regardless of the optics, the greater the distance the lens above the sensor might need to be and sort of become bulkier. And so the smartphone might become thicker, which goes against the trend that we've had the last decade. And smartphones, in general, the goal is to make them thinner and thinner and taller and wider. And we see that on some smartphones in 2020 and 2021, that they are still quite thin, except maybe, what should we say, 20% of the back is twice or three times as thick in some cases because of all of the camera parts that we need to have there. And again, it could be that it will be possible to have artificial intelligence figure things out and figure out what the image should be like. But I'm not entirely convinced that that will work in all circumstances. We'll see. We'll probably know by 2023, 2025 in that case. A question you have to ask yourself as an instructor here is the sensor size versus the use of the camera. What's going to happen to the pictures or to the videos? Let's just stick to assuming we're going to take pictures and not a video. Are you going to make prints out of the pictures that you take? Say an A0 print. In most of the world, standard office paper is A4 size, which is more or less the same as 8.5 and 11 size paper in the United States and Canada. A0 is several of these sheets added together, and we get something which is 119 by 84 centimeters, which is approximately 4 by 3 feet. in terms of size? Is that what we're going to do? Or is the image that you take, the photographic image you take, is actually going to be on a 13-inch screen? And even though most of the world uses the metric system, for certain things we still use this old-fashioned system from who knows when, the 1700s or earlier. And this would mean a 27 by 15 centimeter screen, approximately. Or are the students going to be watching on a smartphone, perhaps a 6-inch screen? Obviously, if you're going to be making prints of your image at A0, then you're going to have to consider that you're going to perhaps need a larger sensor size for this to be successful. And you might need to have more megapixels. But if the student is just going to be looking at this on something at most a 13-inch screen, then maybe the sensor size doesn't need to be as big, and maybe the number of megapixels doesn't have to be quite as big. Bigger is maybe not necessarily better. So if we're going to view it on a smartphone with the sensor, the megapixel, and so forth, everything will be fine. We tend to look at a smartphone, say, 50 centimeters away if it's a 5 or 6-inch screen. If we're looking at a laptop screen, the viewer, she or he, might be looking at it 60, 70, 80 centimeters away. I'm sitting in my office and I have my laptop in front of me, and the screen is about 60 to 70, more 70 centimeters away from me while I'm recording this. If it's a poster, say A2 or A1 in size, most people are going to be looking at the poster 1 meter away, and the larger it gets, if we're moving towards A0, 2 meters or maybe 3 meters away. If we're going to have a picture that's going to be put on a billboard, that we see it as we're walking along, as we're driving, I mean something really large. I wrote 2 meters tall by 15 meters wide. The closest most people will get to it is quite far away, and many people will be seeing it 100 meters away. And the details that you might capture in a very sophisticated camera with a very large sensor size and very many megapixels, it's pointless. No one will be able to see those incredibly small details. You could use your iPhone to take a picture that could be used for a billboard. So the larger the display, the further away people will be looking at it. That's a sort of a general rule. There could be people that would, for some reason, need to go very close and look at something, but this is perhaps less than 1% of people at any given time might be doing that. So for this reason, a large system camera for images and films that are going to be shown on a laptop screen could very well be overkill. Unless you, for some reason, as instructor, need to take part of the image, so you're snapping a picture and then you're going to be using that in a film that you're showing. If you're going to show that very small part of an image and fill the whole screen, then there might be a reason to have a large sensor, say full frame, or let's go for it, medium format kind of a sensor. Let's look a little more closely at this. The distance to viewing versus the screen size. On the x-axis below in blue, we see distances measured in 50 centimeters, 100 centimeters, 150 centimeters, and so forth, all the way up to 300 centimeters or 3 meters. On the right, mixing and matching measurement systems, the size, the diagonal size of the screen. I start with 5 inches and go all the way up to 55 inches. If we have a smartphone, we know that they're probably going to be about 5 or 6 inches in terms of a diagonal screen, perhaps slightly more, but we'll say that not all students can afford to have the latest smartphone. And as I have suggested before, people might be looking at it a little bit under half a meter away, probably closer. If we take a laptop, just like I have now, I've marked it as 15 inches, somewhere between 13 and 17-inch screen, then most people are going to be looking at it at a somewhat greater distance. If we have at our desk or in our home office, if we have a larger computer monitor that we have maybe a little further away, when we need to work with more detail, as opposed to having the laptop screen. We need to be able to see something bigger. I have one at home which is about 22-inch screen, and I have it at a considerable distance compared to the laptop. It's approximately twice as far away from my eyes as the laptop screen. A little further away, I think many people have a television in their living room or someplace. And while they might not be watching television anymore, they're watching Netflix or something else like that. And ours that we have, my wife and I, it's approximately 40 inches in diagonal measurement. And I measured from, earlier today, I measured from the screen to two different places on our sofa. And depending upon where it was, it's an L-shaped sort of sofa. It was somewhere between 2.5 and 3 meters, the distance away. So we could imagine, of course, moving ourselves, that we could put a smartphone someplace, and then we could walk 2.5, 3 meters away and look at it. There wouldn't be much point. It would be very difficult to see any kind of details, and it wouldn't be a good distance to be able to look at that tiny screen. Likewise, we could move to 0.5 meter away from a television, and we could look at that screen. But then we would have the problem of the screen would be so large that it would be hard for us to take in the whole scene. We would see details, and in fact, we might even see some sort of the not necessarily the individual pixels, but we would see problems or imperfections in the picture that would be otherwise invisible to us to see because of the compression that exists when we are looking at the image from a much greater distance. So there seems to be an approximately, in this case, a sort of a linear, approximately, relationship here. The smaller the screen that we're looking at, the closer we look at it. The further away we are, the larger the screen has to be. And to be able to fill the screen with good detail, when the screen is larger, we're going to need to have more resolution. If we have greater resolution broadcast to something on a small screen, the difference between something with extremely high resolution as opposed to something with good resolution will be hard for us to see because of the screen being so small. Is this anything that is new? No, we really can't say that it's anything that is new. Here we're looking at a painting by Seurat. It's claimed that he started in 1884 and completed this in 1886. One of the early post-impressionist painters who style and other style at one point became known as Pointillism. And why is that? Well, the entire painting does not consist of brushstrokes, as impressionist painters would do. It is composed of extremely small dots that the painter painstakingly painted to get this sort of impression. Let's look at a sort of a detail of part of this painting. Let's blow it up. So here we can see what it looks like if you were looking very, very closely at the painting. And if you visit the Art Institute of Chicago, you'll be able to see this. Most people will be standing 3, 4, 5 meters away and looking at this. And if you're like me, you're going to go as close as you can get, but not too close that some guard might start to get worried. And you could actually see even better these dots as opposed to what we see now. And then we go back. And this is approximately what you might see if you're standing 3, 4, 5 meters away from the painting at the Art Institute of Chicago. Not sort of dissimilar from taking pictures where we have, or film where we have millions of tiny pixels in different colors. And if we get close enough, then we can see that the image quality deteriorates, but we can't see the whole picture. So what's the point? So going back to this diagram here, we see the distances, we see the way we're viewing things on various kinds of screens, and this is sort of my unscientific way to suggest what kind of resolution might be needed. If you're looking at a smartphone and you're not looking too close at it, and you're actually holding it at arm's length distance, which might be more than 50 centimeters for some people, you probably would think that the image that you're looking at is okay at 720p. But you might want to look at it in 1080p. If you're sitting watching something on a laptop and maybe moving the direction of a computer monitor screen a little further away, you're probably interested in having it at 1080p, 1080 lines in the image. And then finally, if we're at a much greater distance but with a much larger screen, we might be interested in having images that were in the resolution so-called 4K, 4 times the number of pixels as in 1080p. And then we have this computer monitor, or maybe an even larger monitor at a somewhat greater distance that sort of falls somewhere in between there. So going back here, I said before, are we going to make large prints, or are we going to just have our image looked at on, say, a 13-inch screen? If we're thinking in these terms, this means that most of us, when we are teaching, either if we have it connected our system camera as a webcam and use it, say, in Zoom. Remember again that Zoom only has at most 1080p. Or are we going to have pre-recorded lectures and so forth? This would mean that in a typical lecture, a typical Zoom kind of situation, there's no need to have a full-frame camera sensor with more megapixels, which can provide greater resolution. An APS-C or a Micro Four Thirds sensor will be large enough. And speaking of making prints, I have 2 Micro Four Thirds sensors, and I can very easily make A3 prints. In other words, a double A4, a piece of paper which is twice the size of an 8.5 by 11. This is also an A3, will be twice the size of a typical laptop screen. Or I can make A2 prints. Now, if you look really closely, you might be able to see, shall we say, that there's a sort of pixelation there. But most people who are going to be standing at a distance and looking at a framed print on an A2 size, they're not going to look all that close because it's not designed for that. If you're going to have a larger sensor with more megapixels, of course you can have an A2 size there. And then that will make it easier for somebody to go up close and maybe not see the individual pixels. So in this way of looking at things, and it might not be your way of looking at things, why should we bother to get more expensive cameras, say a full-frame camera and a full-frame lens for videography and teaching? It's a tremendous overkill. Looking back at smartphones as devices for making videos, as of now, we can see high-end smartphone images are getting better and better, but you're still going to have an external microphone to get good quality audio, as I've said before. If we compare a smartphone to a system camera, there isn't all that much glass. The optics in a smartphone are actually not very good at all. And the only reason why the images are reasonably good is that we have all this electronics and programming that goes in and corrects and improves the images. Yes, smartphone images, high-end ones, are getting better and better, but it's not because of the optics. And that's one of the reasons why, if you have a typical webcam, which is producing 1080p, and if you compare this to a system camera with also 1080p, the number of pixels is the same, but the image quality is quite different with the system camera because of the glass, but also because the size of the sensor is going to be bigger. So while it's convenient to work with a smartphone, perhaps, it also, besides the image quality not necessarily being the same, besides the fact that the audio quality will not be all that great, you've sort of locked up your smartphone. If you've forgotten to turn off any sounds, they will start plinging and ringing and so forth, and it'll ruin your take. And of course, if you forget to turn those things off when you're recording, otherwise it'll ruin your take, perhaps. But it might sort of influence what is sometimes referred to as your workflow, and it might not be so good.